I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Elif Shafak has written 19 books, 21 books. I keep seeing different numbers. Her new novel, though, There Are Rivers in the Sky. It's partially a book about a book. It's a book about women's lives. It's a book about silence. If you've read Elif before, you might have a little bit of an idea of what we're getting into, but you know she's also different book to book. So there's that fun. And Charles Dickens has a lot to do with this book, and I started to laugh when I realized what you were doing and where we were going. So, Elif, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
So here's the thing. We've got two timelines. We've got Victorian England and sort of present-day England, but also present-day Middle East, former Mesopotamia, so border of Iraq? Yes? Okay. Two timelines, two rivers, three sort of main characters. And obviously we will be spoiler-free in this conversation, but can I ask when you started working on this book? Because there are lots of moving parts to this novel.
Well, thank you so much. Also, thank you for the lovely introduction. At first glance, I guess this is it is an epic novel in the sense that it does span countries and centuries and continents. So the canvas is quite broad. However, everything in this book is based on a single tiny drop of water. And that was the beginning, actually, that single raindrop. And in so many ways, the book keeps coming back to that raindrop. That was the beginning for me. That was the structure for me. We tend to take it for granted, but actually water is the biggest mystery in our lives. When we talk about the climate crisis today, we are primarily talking about freshwater crisis. And if I add this quickly, you mentioned ancient Mesopotamia and the Middle East. To me, this was a very important part of this book. For us, for those of us who come from the region, this is not a theoretical, some abstract question. Water is an acutely urgent crisis at this moment in time, because when we're talking about the most water-stressed nations, out of the most water-stressed 10 nations in the world, 7 are in the Middle East and in North Africa. So, in other words, our rivers are drying, our rivers are dying, and this has massive, massive consequences for everyone, for sure, but especially, I would say, for women and children and minorities. And this book does very much focus on them.
And in case listeners are thinking, well, the water issue is really just limited to the places that Elif just spoke about, the Colorado River, which runs across the west coast of the U.S. and mostly through California and Arizona and whatnot, we are looking at a crisis there as well. Water levels are dropping very significantly in the Colorado, and we can't pretend that we don't need to pay attention to this too in the U.S. So, I mean, we're not quite in the situation that the North African countries are in, but we are not as far away from it as some might think. And I'm just going to take that minute to throw that out there. But these characters, we've got two women that I'm very, very, well, a little girl and a woman, and I'm very fond of them. And then you've got this guy, Arthur, who I was not expecting. Arthur Smith, king of the slums and the sewers. Can we talk about using multiple characters, though, to tell? I mean, obviously, if you're going to be around the globe in time and whatnot, you do need a wider cast, but all of them really distinct, really unique, really smart and interesting, funny.
Yes, and humor matters. Humor is, I think, an important part of my work. Even though I deal with difficult subjects, sometimes quite heartbreaking subjects, I'm also someone who appreciates our need for humor. It's like our oxygen. But as you said, this is a book that revolves around 3 fictional characters who seem to be completely different at first glance, but are connected in a very surprising way. And then 2 rivers, the River Thames in the UK and the River Tigris in the Middle East. And then 1 poem, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh. So 3, 2, 1. And it's water that connects them all. With regards to the diversity of characters and stories and threads, this is not something that I planned beforehand. It grew in that way organically. But also, I think, because of my own life, my own journeys, I am a commuter. I am a nomad. I'm an immigrant. I'm not only an immigrant in the UK, but also an immigrant in the English language. As you can hear in my accent, this is not my native tongue. This is not my mother tongue. It's an acquired language for me. So questions with regards to home, belonging, exile, displacement. How does it feel to be uprooted, almost deracinated, but then rerouted? Finding new belongings and multiple belongings, all of these questions are very, very close to my heart. And I think you can see echoes of this in my work always.
Turkish was your first language, Spanish was your second, and English is your third, right? And you had originally started writing your novels and nonfiction in Turkish and then switched to English. So there's
Correct.
a bit of Joseph Conrad happening here.
It was quite an irrational move, if I may put it this way. You know, it wasn't a planned decision or a very rational decision. It was more like an instinct, a need for breathing space. As you mentioned, I wrote my earlier novels in Turkish first, but then there came a point about 20 years ago, I switched. And that was because of a need for more freedom of speech, or almost like an existential space. It is quite challenging to be a novelist in Turkey or of Turkish descent. And I would say there's an additional layer of difficulty when you happen to be a woman. So, and these are things that we don't usually talk about, but I think we must. What I have experienced is whatever you write about, whether it's, if you question official historiography, you can be put on trial. If you write about gender violence, issues like child abuse, difficult subjects, you can be put on trial. So from politics to sexuality, anything and everything can offend the authorities. And because of a word, because of a paragraph, because of a tweet, you can be put on trial or exiled or even imprisoned. There's always that knowledge at the back of our minds. Somehow, writing in English gave me a cognitive distance and maybe made things a little bit lighter in my heart, even though it's more challenging for me to write in another language. Perhaps psychologically, I felt a sense of lightness that I sorely needed. It's a bit like you take a step back when you want to see a painting more closely. You don't necessarily get closer. And that cognitive distance perhaps allowed me to take a closer look at the land and the culture where I come from.
The intersection and overlap between these characters and these timelines. And I had so many moments as I was reading where I realized you had called back to something earlier or you were flashing forward to something else. And it's such a joy to read the new novel, even though, yes, there is, I will absolutely admit, there is some stuff that is uncomfortable. But knowing that, you've said this in other interviews, that there is no other, right? When you're a novelist, you can't have another. You have to be related to all of these people. And you know, you like to meet sort of the reader on a level field, right? And not put yourself above the experience. And it's wild to hear you say you don't plan your novels, because as much as this is a seamless reading experience, or was for me, a lot happens. A lot happens. And you're saying intuition is the thing that brings you through.
That is true. And I so appreciate the question, because it matters to me a lot. Broadly speaking, I think there are two different paths. The first path, I mean, when you're a novelist, the first path is a bit more definitely cerebral, much more intellectual, in which the novelist wants to be above the text and knows what each and every character is going to do in the next 5 chapters, if not, you know, in the end, the very end. The end is almost clear as you start the novel. I have a lot of respect for people who write in this way, but it is not my way. I like the second path, in which you are a little bit drunk, you know, as a writer. You're not walking a straight linear path. You don't quite know what you're doing. You don't quite know what the characters are going to do, but you have a strong intuition. But the one thing that's that is important for me is for me to trust my intuition. I need to do a lot of reading and research and thinking beforehand, just to know what I'm talking about, to be ready to learn. I think writers are always learners. Of course, we're primarily readers, but we also need to be good listeners. and we need to listen to everyone and everything in life and keep learning. And sometimes we need to unlearn, because there's so many stereotypes, cliches, and dogmas that we might have internalized without even being aware of it. So there's a lot of learning and unlearning going on. But there comes a moment when I am like, okay, I can fly now. I can let my intuition guide me. And from that moment onwards, it's a river. The river flows and I follow it.
You know, there's a line in this novel, and I should remember exactly which character said this, but I just know it's in the book, where you say that some people are restless like rivers. And I sort of feel like, listening to you, that you are absolutely one of these people who is perfectly happy to follow where you might end up. But you did do quite a lot of research. I mean, Arthur is sort of based on an actual person, though Arthur is absolutely your own creation. Can we just talk about him for a second? Because really the Dickensian bits really did have me laughing. How can you not?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I love that line that you mentioned, which is, some people are restless like rivers. Actually, it refers to a line in the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Okay.
Imagine thousands and thousands of years ago, this was expressed. People said this, and I think it's quite wise. What the question is, of course, what do we do with our restlessness? Can we try to turn it into something a bit more constructive for ourselves and for our communities and for our societies? I love the Victorian component of this book. Maybe it's an odd thing for a writer to say this, but I really, really felt it in my heart so deeply. My character, King Arthur of the sewers and the slums, of course, he's a fictional character, no doubt, but he's also loosely based upon a real historical figure who was called George Smith. And I loved reading about him, thinking about him. I think if he were alive today, the actual George Smith, we would understand and we would respect his mind, and we would know that he's somewhere on autism spectrum, this beautiful mind of his, which could remember numbers and letters. He had a very strong visual memory. But of course, at the time, no one appreciated this. And on top of that, he was born into poverty, a very disadvantaged upbringing. The actual George Smith today, as we're speaking, he's buried actually between Syria and Turkey. He's someone who has come to the Middle East twice, and in order to find the missing lines in the Epic of Gilgamesh, more specifically in the flood tablet, he lost his life. And not many people know about him, to be honest. So the story of water, the story of raindrop brought me to the flood tablet, to the Epic of Gilgamesh, and that brought me to this amazing, fascinating character, and to Victorian era England, Europe, but also the US at the time. The reason why I mention this is because we're talking about an era in which there's a big duality growing between faith and science, or religion and science. This is a time when Darwin is publishing his work, and the flood tablet causes a huge, huge rift between these two groups. So it's important in so many ways.
Well, and there are a couple of points, too, where Arthur comes out and says he's speaking to a group of explorers at one, like very wealthy members of the Explorers Club in London. And he says, well, actually, the Epic of Gilgamesh is older than the Bible. And then at a different point, he comes back and says, it's actually older than Greek myths.
Yeah, that is so true.
And I'd never quite had it in that context before. I mean, I've read it once. I'm not entirely sure I got everything. But at the same time, I love the idea that this poem has been around
for so long. Indeed. I mean, we're talking about thousands of years of history, but we should also remember that before it was written down by scribes on cuneiform tablets, clay tablets, it was transmitted orally from grandmothers to grandchildren, again for thousands of years. We're talking about the oldest piece of literature, work of literature that is known to humanity. And I think in so many ways, the Epic of Gilgamesh is quite relevant to our times. In so many ways, it does talk about climate crisis. It does talk about a flood, the destruction of an entire ecosystem. But it also talks about this perhaps search, quest for, if not immortality, youth. How do we prolong youth, which is, again, very much on the minds of so many people today. It is a story that's about power, how power corrupts, how absolute power corrupts. But also, I think it's important to notice there are no clear-cut heroes in the story. In many Greek myths, which I love, I adore Greek myths, but you right away know who is the hero and who is not. Whereas in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you start with a character who is flawed in so many ways. He's not a nice person at all. He's a brute. He's a terrible human being. And through journeys and loss and friendship, but also failure, defeat, he comes back having achieved nothing but a very much wiser human being. So I find it very interesting that this old epic does not have a hero at its center, but if not an anti-hero, in fact.
An empire runs through the entire book.
Yeah.
And the idea that we've got Arthur leaving the UK to go to the Middle East because he's essentially chasing a poem. He's chasing fragments of a poem.
Yeah.
But the representations of empire, whether it's Uncle Malik again, Zuleika's father, your scientist character, who I quite like, her father's stand-in, I should say, he's her uncle. He's created a life for himself where he's, actually in the House of Lords in the UK. He's obviously very wealthy, but he has no connection to his homeland. And in fact, sort of keeps pieces of himself hidden from his family. He talks about how important it is to be close to your family. And he's like, yeah, but you can't have all of me.
Yeah.
Even you can't have all of me. Yeah. And to see that bit of empire flipped, right? Here's someone who's come to sort of the land of his colonizer and is just like, yep, this is what I want.
Yeah.
I don't want my niece to be grateful. I want her to be happy. And that's a wild distinction to make.
I am deeply interested in the story of empires, plural. I'm Turkish. At the same time, I've become British over the years. So we're talking about two different empires which have dealt with their past in very different ways. If I may very briefly start with Turkey. Of course, Turkey has a very long and rich history, but that does not translate into a strong memory. I think just the opposite. We're a society of collective amnesia. And so our entire relationship with the past is full of ruptures. And it made me think more carefully about this because the story of the past, the story of the empire changes depending on who is telling the narrative and who is not allowed to tell the story. The moment you ask, well, what was the Ottoman Empire like for maybe an Armenian silversmith or a Jewish miller or a Kurdish peasant or an Arab farmer or a Greek sailor? What was history like for women? For a woman, for a concubine in the harem, then suddenly you find this huge silence that history books never, ever talk about. So the history that we learn at school in Turkey is his story. And by that, I mean a few men in positions of power. And I think literature, one of the many reasons why I love literature so much is because literature is not only interested in stories, but also in silences. And the silenced and the forgotten and untold stories. Now, there are also so many untold stories within British history. The book takes a very close look at the past of British Museum. And of course, this is a debate that concerns not only British Museum, but the Louvre, the Metropolitan. There are echoes in the book, So who owns the past? We have to ask this question. It's an important question. But I think again, literature and art is a wonderful venue to open up these very difficult and complex debates because unlike social media, where people are immediately polarized and everything is reduced into snippets of information, inside a novel, you can hold nuanced thoughts and calm debates. So the book does take a very critical look, in my opinion, with regards to the colonial history, institutional history of British Museum. But at the same time, I can honor, I can love the passion and the genuine dedication that individual archaeologists and scholars like George Smith have shown. So I can do multiple things at the same time if I am inside a novel.
There's a spirit of discovery and exploration that hits all three storylines in different ways, obviously. But I'm thinking of Naren's grandmother, the 9-year-old. Her grandmother certainly is engaged with the world in a way that some of us have seen our grandparents engage in the world with, right? There's this mix of the traditional and the I've got to figure it out because there's a tiny person standing next to me, right? Yeah. And then certainly Arthur figuring out how he's going to make a life for himself because his path coming out of the slums was not ever destined to lead him to the British Museum. So even there, you know, because he had his apprenticeship as a printer and was able to learn and all of that was never going to be his trajectory either. And even Zuleika, who's a scientist, at one point her uncle says to her, well, dear, if you'd like to do that, that's fine. I don't really see a future in it. And I cannot think of a single parent who might actually say that to a young person in this day and age. Like, I just don't see a future in science. But seeing all of these lines come together, and yet they're all engaged in their worlds. They all want to understand what's happening around them. There is kind of a joyfulness to it.
You know, I so appreciate that you touched upon these different points in the book because they really matter to me a lot. On both sides of the Atlantic, I have observed many immigrant families, first, second, third generations, or any family that has experienced some kind of displacement or a complex history. And I'm always struck by these generational differences when it comes to dealing with memory and amnesia. And I think in these families, oftentimes what you see is the oldest generation, the elderly, the ones who have experienced the biggest traumas and hardships. Of course, they have not forgotten the past, but they do not necessarily talk about the past. It's almost like it sits somewhere inside their chest. And maybe they have a different language. Sometimes food is a language. Maybe, you know, gestures. They are ways of expression, but they don't talk about the past. The second generation, broadly speaking, they don't talk about the past either because they have to be future-oriented, forward-looking. They need to find their feet. It has to be tabula rasa, new beginning. I understand that instinct and need. But that leaves the third or the fourth generations in these families. In other words, the youngest in these families who are today asking the biggest, the sharpest questions about identity, memory, their ancestors' heritage and journeys. So you can come across young people with old memories. And that really fascinates me always.
I'm going to ask you a question that you've asked of other people because it's a little bit of a riff on what you just said. But, you know, why can't we have concentric circles of identity, right? You use Audre Lorde often as an example, that she has multiple identities. I think of each of these characters having multiple identities, whether they know it or not. In some cases, they don't necessarily know. Arthur's very Victorian, as he should be.
As he should be.
As he should be, but he does have multiple identities.
And I genuinely believe we all do. And I wish we could stop talking about identity as if it were a single, static, monolithic block, and maybe use water metaphors to understand identity, which is perhaps closer to who we are as human beings. But I'm so glad you mentioned Audre Lorde. Many years ago, I moved from Istanbul to Boston. I spent about 5 years in the States. And that first year in America was important for me, especially in this wonderful Gothic library in Mount Holyoke. I spent the whole year reading the works of African-American women's movement, particularly throughout 1960s and 1970s. And what struck me was many of those people, poets, writers, activists we're talking about, they spoke about power in a much more nuanced and complex way than we do today. And also about identity, because many of them came from Black and brown communities. They were on the receiving end of racism. They knew how racism worked. Like many of them came from LGBTQ plus communities. They knew how homophobia or biphobia or transphobia worked. And again, many of them came from disadvantaged communities in terms of class hierarchies. So they were also aware of further inequalities. And hence, when they talk about power, they're aware of all those multiple layers of power. But also there's what I see in people like Audre Lorde, but also in James Baldwin, is the celebration of multiplicity, you know, the multitudes within, like Walt Whitman used to say. And I think we have forgotten this to a large extent today. So why not think of identity like ripples in water? Of course, where we come from, the journeys, the stories of our ancestors, these are very dear to our hearts. But at the same time, we can have more circles of identity around that, connecting us to a country, a continent. And as the circles get wider, we're also citizens of humanity, citizens of the world. Throughout Brexit in the UK, there have been populist leaders and demagogues who have been telling us that if you're a citizen of humankind, it means you're a citizen of nowhere. And I strongly disagree with that. I think you can be a citizen of the world and care about many things and have a strong attachment to where you come from. It is possible to have local and global connections at the same time.
At least that's what makes it interesting for me. You know, I was born in Boston, but I keep a foot, in Asia because I have family there. And not just because I have family there, but I get both, right? Yeah. I get both, and I like having both. Yeah. I love the way you talk about having nuance, though, in novels again. I mean, one of the things I love about reading is that I have to slow down slightly. I read faster on a screen than I do on paper, and I think that's pretty much true of a lot of folks. But having to slow down and piece together, and again, it's so satisfying when you see these hints pop in the story, and I'm really trying not to spoil things because it was such a delight when I was like, oh, that just happened. But this idea that, life is messy and unpredictable, and yet there are kind of signs, right? Like there are kind of signs, there are behaviors that carry, and there are moments of intersection that, absolutely.
So beautiful what you said, and perhaps it brings us back to grandmothers again, because we're talking about traditions of storytelling that are not necessarily Eurocentric. One part of me is very much attached to the European canon of the novel, but that's not my only route. I also feel very attached to the stories, particularly oral stories of the Balkans, Anatolia, the Middle East, the Levant, or the Mediterranean. And in many of these stories that I heard from my own grandmother growing up, you are not necessarily in control of everything. There is chaos in the world, but at the same time, there are patterns. So there's both solid and liquid, and there's recognition of both, of all these forces, in almost like a dialectical relationship. It's a different type of storytelling. And to the best of my ability, I would like my work to bridge written culture and oral culture and to bridge different kinds of storytelling. Sometimes it's difficult to explain this or to talk about this. But I think as we read from all across the world, not just the same type of books again and again, but we need to diversify our reading list. Let's read from East and West, across the board, fiction and nonfiction. And then we realize that there are different paths within the big kingdom of Storyland.
You said this, and I've said this, and we are certainly not the only people to have said it, but, we all bring ourselves to whatever we're reading. And that's part of the fun of it, is being knocked out of your comfort zone and sort of experiencing someone else's. I'm extremely clear that I would quite like to have not ever lived in Victorian England. And luckily that's how the whole thing worked out for me, because no, not for me. Thanks very much. But I love reading about it. And I love meeting people like Arthur. And okay, a houseboat on the Thames doesn't sound so terrible, but science was not going to be my bag. So Zuleika is, kind of doing her thing. And certainly Naren and her grandmother have an entirely different story. And I love not knowing exactly where I am, right? I just want to kind of hand myself over to the narrative voice, to the author, whatever you want to call it, and just be like, you know what, tell me a story. Tell me a story, because I know I can find something, like as you were opening the show talking about the water crisis in North Africa right now. And I'm like, well, actually, you're not alone in that. Those are the moments. I love reading a novel and having that sort of reminder put in front of me.
I am the same way. And that's why it breaks my heart when some readers, and it's usually male readers of a certain age who do this with all the good intentions. They tell me that so much is happening in the world that in order to keep up with the world, they read technology, they read about finance, economy, history, philosophy, neuroscience, important stuff. And then they say, with almost an apologetic smile, they say, but my wife reads fiction. My girlfriend reads fiction, as if fiction is a domain of women because they associate it with emotions. And I think we need to challenge that. Inside fiction, there is everything that is inside life. There is politics in a novel. There is history. There is philosophy or technology. But perhaps more importantly, there's emotional intelligence. And I honestly don't know a single person in this world who does not need to connect with their emotions. Whatever we may be doing in this life, from designers to dentists, students to scholars, we all need to develop our own emotional connections and emotional intelligence. So fiction does deal with truth. It does tell us so much about the world, but without preaching, without teaching, in its own gentle way. And I think we need this, especially in today's extremely polarized and bitterly politicized world.
I think, too, that it's good to remember that AI is really only as good as the people who program it.
Yeah.
That it doesn't exist in a vacuum. I mean, I realize AI is getting very, very smart very, very quickly. But again, it starts with a human piece, like robots, however they're programmed, same thing. Like, you can't take out the human piece entirely. It just actually won't work. Like, literally, it will not work. And to be able to walk into, right? Like, a novel is reliably some sort of time travel. It's some sort of, physical travel, right? Place is very, very important in all of your books, regardless of what you're writing about or how you're writing about it. I always have a very strong sense of place. And again, it may not be a map that I recognize, but I understand the circumstances in which I'm engaging with a lot of really interesting ideas and smart characters. You don't read novels when you're writing novels, though. You read a lot of poetry. And when I saw the list, I was like, Whitman, Yeats, Akhmatova.
Yes.
I mean, you really, in a lot of ways, are sort of doing a whole modern classics kind of moment with your own literary engagement.
I'm really enjoying this conversation so much. And I think what we have to keep alive is this childish curiosity that we had, all of us had this, but because of the way we're raised, because we fear the judgment of others, because we think we should behave in a certain way, little by little, we forget that childish curiosity. So primarily to be curious about life, not to be afraid of asking questions. Why is this like that? Can we talk about these silences? Can we talk about these taboos? But I also think that our reading lists need to be eclectic, because the mind always learns better from differences. Like, if all my friends speak like me, think like me, then it means I'm surrounded with maybe reflections of myself or echoes of my own voice. And that is not a very creative existence. It can be quite narcissistic. That is why in big cities or in diverse settings, when you can come across people who were born into a different religion, different culture, different ethnicity, when you break bread together, really something shifts in you. When you fall in love with someone who comes from a different background, I really believe these are precious encounters. And unfortunately, the age we're living in very quickly discarded words like multiculturalism or diversity has suddenly become a negative term in the lexicon of some populist demagogues. But I come from a country that has almost never appreciated diversity. And I think by losing that, we have lost a lot.
And if you think about the Ottoman Empire, tiny segue, if you think about the Ottoman Empire, at least the way I was taught about the Ottoman Empire in the States, was just the sheer landmass that it covered. It actually did pull from multiple traditions. I mean, it ran all the way from what we now call Russia, back into Turkey, which is the exact sort of midpoint between Asia and Europe. And then it drops down as far south as, I don't know, how far south do we consider the Ottoman Empire? Did it hit North Africa, right? So it really...
Yes.
So, I mean, if you look at just the sheer volume of land and cultures and people that it covered.
Absolutely. And for over 600 years. So we're talking about, an empire with a very long life. But of course, it doesn't mean that, as we touched upon earlier, that everyone lived within that empire, the same rights, with the same, equal ground. But it's interesting, of course, that multi-ethnic, multilingual combination. I'm always interested in history, cultural history, the history of silences, the history of minorities. And I think there's a part of me, I mean, this is how we started our conversation, that tries to understand anyone who has been made to feel like the other for whatever reason. There's a part of me that wants to understand their loneliness, the way they have been mistreated, and why that was the case. Until you realize, actually, the person you might have regarded as the other is my brother, the other is my sister. Then you realize I am the other. I love that transformative power of literature. It really dismantles dualities.
You said a word, though, a second ago, lonely. And your characters are lonely. I mean, Zuleika is lonely. Arthur is lonely. Naren is lonely. And they have families, but they're still lonely. So this idea that, the reader can convert themselves out of seeing the other, in a way, we can do that because all three of these characters are wrestling with their own self-concept and saying, well, I am kind of the other in my community, in my family, in the world. And that's when we get to say, oh, but wait, but I get you.
Indeed. Yes. And I think it's a concept that I think about a lot. Of course, when you're a novelist, your life, a big chunk of your life is also based on solitude. It's a very solitary art. We don't do teamwork. You have to spend so much time, weeks, months, years, inside your own imagination. There is that. There's also my own upbringing, because I was an only child raised by a single working mom. At the time in Turkey, this was quite unusual. And I thought life was very boring, to be honest. And this is how I started to write, because Storyland to me was much more real, much more interesting. But I think what really fascinates me is, just like the writer is alone, the reader is also alone when they are inside a work of fiction. And something happens to our minds, our hearts, as we go through that journey. Because in our daily lives, we're constantly in the company of other people, and we just go along with groups and collective identities. Maybe we forget that when you are alone and when you connect with characters on paper, when you start to empathize with people who might seem to be very different than you at first glance, I think you open up your heart, I have met many people, many readers in Turkey who come from quite conservative backgrounds. And if you talk to them in their daily lives, they might tell you really terrible cliches and stereotypes about particularly minorities. But it's the same people who would come to me and say, I read your novel, and this is the character that I related with the most. And maybe that character is gay, or that character is from this or that minority that they might have been biased towards, in their normal lives. So that always fascinates me, the moment we break apart, away from collective identities, when we become an individual, not in a selfish way, but in such a way that allows us to connect with the rest of humanity beyond all mental borders. That is something that fascinates me. And I think literature and art can do that. They can connect us beyond borders.
There's really nothing that compares with getting lost in a good book, right? Because you have the time. Maybe you need to put it down for 5 minutes so you can walk away, get a snack, and think about what you just read. Or maybe you just want to reread the same sentence again and again because it's so breathtakingly beautiful and you cannot believe that no one has ever said it that way before, kind of thing, right? There's so much to engage with, but you can do it at your own pace.
Yes.
And if you really want to read this book in a night, you probably could. It is the story is very propulsive. And also the puzzling out of how everyone is connected is terrific. I mean, the payoff is great. I chose not to race through it as much as I was enjoying myself, because as much as I wanted to know where we were going and how this was all going to come together, I also did not want it to end. And this is kind of the constant tension for any reader, right? And you're just like, how many times I've heard someone say, well, I wish I could read it again for the first time.
Yeah.
Which is something we say a lot on the shop floor. Because it's really exciting when you can introduce someone to just an entire universe. And, you know, we use universe and we use world building. We limit ourselves when we only talk about sci-fi and fantasy that way. I mean, any novel is world building.
Absolutely.
Dickensian England, total world building. If suddenly Arthur is breaking off and going to McDonald's, not one of us is going to buy it. If, however, you know, he's learning how to work a printing press when he's 10, we have the context for that piece of humanity. Did you surprise yourself as you were writing this book, though? I know intuition was guiding you, but that's not the same as surprise. I mean, were you ever at a point where you're like, wait, that just happened?
Yes, of course. I mean, and it does happen quite a lot, actually, which doesn't mean that every week, every day you feel like you're flying. Sometimes you're crawling on the floor. There are weeks when you doubt yourself, you doubt what you're writing. So you go through valleys of anxiety, mountains of depression. That's also part of the writing process. But I love it when my characters surprise me. I love it when, you know, all those connections, they just fall into place and you hear them almost click. That is such an amazing feeling. And it's, again, the art of storytelling, because you almost tap into something bigger than yourself, you know, much more important than yourself. I've always felt this, like in my daily life, I'm a much more anxious person. I'm a very clumsy person. When I'm writing, it's almost like you're using a different part of your brain, or perhaps it's like different types, different sides of your personality come together in harmony, and you can be free and you can be multiple, and maybe you can be a little bit wiser, maybe a little bit bolder than you are in your daily life. So that transformation to me is remarkable. I really mean it when I say books change us. I experience it all the time. It happened to me. And I know it is happening as we're speaking. When we read a story, something shifts in us and they change us.
Well, and also you've talked about this in other interviews, but Don Quixote was a touchstone for you. Dickens' Tale of Two Cities was the first Dickens you read, and you've never looked back. And, you know, I think I'm quoting you correctly when you say he was your friend, because you were just at a place where it was like, well, it's a good thing I have him. Dostoevsky, of course. You know, all of these really sort of epic thinkers as well, right? These were all writers who were kind of like, yeah, I don't like what's happening around me. I'm just going to figure out how to work it out on the page. But the book I've really been wanting to ask you about, and I just figured the conversation would get us there, Orlando.
Yes.
Virginia Woolf's Orlando is one of your favorite characters in literature. And again, I get the Dickens, I get Don Quixote, I get Dostoevsky. Orlando was a little bit of a surprise, though. And I'm sure I will understand exactly why this character is your favorite once you explain it. But at the same time, I'm kind of like, okay, please explain.
Well, it has, it left a big impact on me. But I must tell you that I have read Orlando several times throughout my life.
Yeah.
And it wasn't the same reading. Each time it was different. But I will never forget the first time I read Orlando. It really struck me. Until then, I did not know you could write a novel with such a sense of freedom, that you could dare to go beyond borders of geography, time, gender, identity, that you could fly that high, that freely, without worries. To me, it's a book that I very much associate with water. You know, it's water-like. It's a book that I very much associate with freedom. So it changed me in so many ways. Virginia Woolf herself changed me, but in particular, Orlando. And of course, I love the Turkey connections, you know, the fact that the character also comes to Turkey, to Bursa, and so on. Those also resonated with me. But primarily, it was this fluid nature of the storytelling. And the very fact that she dared to do this so early on in time was, to me, is fascinating. I love Virginia Woolf as a writer, but also as a public intellectual, as a thinker. Here in the UK, we have a very negative interpretation of the word intellectual, as if it means someone is arrogant. But I think we need more public intellectuals who are women, who come from minority backgrounds, who come from working class backgrounds. We need to hear their voices in the public space. So to me, it matters that Virginia Woolf was an important public intellectual.
Are you still teaching?
Not at the moment, but
okay.
I love the academia. I've stayed in academia for a long time, on and on. Yeah.
Because I feel like a little bit of sort of the love of ideas and certainly, well, research.
Yes.
It is clear you do quite a lot of research. And I never feel like I'm being sort of fed my cultural vegetables. I don't mean it to sound like that, but I feel like I'm in very good hands, and clearly lots of homework has been done. And now I get to read a story. I mean, I'm also thinking about 10 minutes, 38 seconds in this strange world. And certainly the last book, The Island of Missing Trees, which was in part narrated by a tree. And I can hear some eyebrows being raised out there in the world. And if you know the basic storyline of 10 minutes and 38 seconds, you'll understand why I'm including it here. It was also a finalist for the Booker Prize in 2019. But that freedom, now I get it. Now I totally understand.
That freedom, which also exists actually in the oral tradition stories of, again, the Middle East, the Anatolia, at least the ones that I've heard from my grandmother growing up. I mean, in her universe, water could speak, mountains could murmur, trees could whisper. It was okay. No one would think that you were mad. So there's a part of me that maybe wants to honor those traditions. I love ecofeminism, the kind of feminism that tries to connect the dots. But primarily it's the art of storytelling that takes me in that direction. If a tree is going to speak, if I can hear that voice inside my head, if it comes naturally, organically to me, then I do it. Which doesn't mean it's easy. I mean, I wish you could see my agent's face when I first told him that I'm going to write a novel and there's going to be a tree at the heart of it and this tree is going to speak. And I saw the doubt in his face, understandably, because if it doesn't work, the whole novel collapses. It is such a risk. It is a risk for an author. But I really, really felt this voice inside my heart. And it felt very natural to me. So I wanted to follow that voice.
But also, shouldn't art take risks? I mean, we don't all want to look at the same thing. I mean, there are certain wings at the museum where I'm like, yep, great, thanks, been there, done that. Occasionally happy to dip in, but it's not something that you want to sort of stare at constantly, or at least I don't. I'm always looking for something where it's like, well, I haven't seen that before.
Yeah.
Let's see where we can go. And I love the idea that we can treat fiction sort of similarly. It's like, well, I've done that piece before. Let's see what we can get standing somewhere else or listening to a different voice. And voice for me is everything. Voice is the thing that keeps me in a story. I mean, a lot happens in There Are Rivers in the Sky, but a lot happens because of the people and who they are. And I was really invested in the people, and I was really invested in their voices, and I was really invested in the overall voice of the novel. And I sort of feel like, just given everything I've learned about you as I was researching for the show, voice is the thing.
Absolutely.
Voice is absolutely the thing for you, where it's like, when you have the voice and where you want to go.
That is so true. And, there are moments when you feel scared as a writer because you realize, oh my goodness, this is a broad, big canvas. And I think it would be naive not to realize that there are so many glass walls within the literary world, not only glass ceilings. When women write books full of ideas, they're immediately called as ambitious, not so much male novelists. If you happen to be a woman writer from outside Europe, or if you happen to be a woman writer from a minority background, again, I think the same thing holds true. There are additional glass walls that you bump into. You don't realize they're there. For instance, if you happen to be an Afghan woman writer, right, you're expected to write the stories of women in Afghanistan, which you may or may not choose to do in one novel, but maybe the next novel is going to be something different. almost no one expects an Afghan novelist to write sci-fi or avant-garde fiction or experimental fiction, right? So immediately we're put into boxes, we're pigeonholed. It's also, there's another challenge. If one book becomes relatively successful, whatever success means, immediately there's expectation that you should continue producing similar stories in your next work. But as you said, we have to take risks. We need to go into, in other directions, discover, learn, almost start from scratch again. So that quality of writing is very important to me. And we can only do this if we dismantle those boxes that we're constantly being pushed into.
That seems like a perfect place to end the conversation, because you and I could keep going for hours and hours and hours. So I'm going to say thank you so much, Elif Shafak. The new novel is There Are Rivers in the Sky. It's out now. And certainly if you haven't read Bastard of Istanbul, if you haven't read 10 minutes, 38 seconds in this strange world, and if you haven't read The Island of Missing Trees, those are some pretty great places to start with the backlist if that's what you're looking for. Thank you, Elif. This has been so great.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful and I enjoy this so, so much. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.